So that was a little punk rock for us. So, do you remember that song?
I do.
Okay. Did you listen to it growing up?
I wouldn't say that I had purchased any albums, but I did hear it on the radio.
Okay. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Well, I'm your father.
Hi, Dad. All right, so during this interview, we're just going to talk a little bit about punk rock and the culture and history during the late 20th century. Sound good?
Well, it's your assignment.
Okay. First question I have for you is, what do you remember about the popular culture of the late 20th century?
So, I was born in the 60s, so I don't remember a whole lot about the 60s. The 70s, I was growing up. I remember the post-Vietnam War, which changed a lot of people's beliefs and did a lot to do with anti-draft movements and people basically being shown on television on the nightly news in atrocities that were happening. It was a guerrilla warfare. It was very, very difficult to watch on television and to see the different things that were happening over there in close hand-to-hand support combat. And it was on the news, and it had a big influence on the people back then in the 1970s. And when the war came to the end in the early 70s, I think there was a lot of that resentment towards what was going on over in the Vietnam era. So I think that was something that really changed popular culture in the 70s. Of course, we had the disco in the 70s, which was kind of a very carefree lifestyle. People went out, they went to these discos. They were introduced to different types of drugs, things like that. Big discos in New York City, and I remember even in high school, I remember having disco music at our dances. It was a different time, but it was a very carefree time, I think, where people just kind of enjoyed themselves, and there wasn't a lot of big major issues going with that. Then moving on to the 80s, and that was the end of the Cold War in 1989. And I think the 80s were pretty good times. Once again, it was a kind of a free-willing type society. People had a lot of fun going out. There wasn't a lot of things to worry about. You didn't have the problems you have today with the violence that goes on at group gatherings. And I think the 80s were great times. And the Cold War came to an end, and that changed the way people thought when they basically took the wall down in 1989 in Berlin. And the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic came to an end. You had these different states that arose, and then the former states. And then bottom line is, you had a lot of immigration, which changed a lot of our culture into the United States. And then the 90s were pretty good times, if I remember correctly. And I do remember the 90s once again. It was a very free-willing time with not a whole lot of things to worry about that we have today to worry about as far as our safety and security. And that takes us up to the 2000s.
So how was your youth culture different from today?
Well, I can tell you flat out, it was less violent as it is today. The one thing that I do remember the most about the difference between the society is we didn't have the internet, which you all have today. So I think that changes a lot. Your access to information, social media. I mean, you think about kids today with devices in their hands. You yourself know, and Christopher, that you don't go very far without your device. And it's a very, very, it's like a lifeline almost to some people. I personally thought it was a great thing when we first got the capabilities to text and we had cellular phones, because I remember the days I didn't have cellular phones or texting capabilities. Now, I dread it. You never leave work. You're always at work 24 hours a day. But getting back to the differences between society, we didn't have all those gadgets. We didn't have all those things that you have today. Now, whether we were better off then or better off now, who knows? But I will tell you this, we also didn't have the violence, the school shootings, the active shooter situations with people, the different issues that are brought up now in school. The biggest thing for us growing up was if you got caught chewing gum, then you'd go to detention. And that would be a major thing. Now it's trying to survive a shooting in a school. It's a lot different than when I was growing up.
So what do you specifically remember about punk rock? What bands did you listen to?
So I remember it was loud. I remember that I could never tell when one song changed to the next song. I had to listen very closly. I actually had the opportunity to see the Ramones in concert when I was a police officer in the state of New Hampshire back in I would say it was probably in the mid-'80s. I watched the Ramones, and then all of a sudden I watched a bunch of kids running into each other. They called it slam dancing. And then I remember having to give emergency medicine to one of the individuals and make sure that 2 people got escorted out of there via ambulance to get stitches for being hurt from running into each other with their heads. It was loud music. They were expressing themselves, shouting. Of course, then you had the Clash, which I actually liked the Clash, combat rock. And that was kind of a takeoff on that. You had the Sex Pistols, and I was never really a big follower of punk rock. But there were a few songs, like the one you played, I Want to Be Sedated, that I remember in clubs hearing it and kind of liking it. But I mean, I wasn't a big fan of it.
Do you think that a lot of people still listen to some of the songs?
I think people that grew up during that time frame, because it was big back then, and if it was part of your listening genre, then you'd probably still listen to it. Yeah, you'd probably go back. It's like I go back and listen to the music that I liked in the '80s, because it's kind of a comfort, to go back and listen to some of those songs.
Do you believe that punk rock had an influence on popular music?
I think every genre has an influence on pop music, going back as far as Elvis Presley, the music before him in the 50s. I mean, it kind of, it's a step-by-step approach. The Beatles came in and they changed the way we all heard music. They were amazing to have as many hits as they did over that time period. And they changed a lot of the way that people listened to it, because they introduced, they started off with just short songs and basically moved into some really heavy, not heavy metal, but you got songs like Helter Skelter and things. It's just different generation. I think every genre has some influence on the progression of music. I think punk rock is the same.
My last question for you would be, what kind of legacy do you think punk rock has left, if any?
Well, I think as a legacy goes, I think that the most people, when you think of punk rock and the Ramones and the early bands, you think they recruited a certain type of group that wanted to express themselves, and that's how they did it, was through the music, to go to the clubs or go out to see them play. And I think it was a form of expression, and I think that that will obviously have a lot to do with the progression of music, because other genres have picked up that and have done it in different ways.
All right. Well, thank you for your time, and that's it.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.